Hello and welcome back. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of forgiveness, and not just concept of forgiveness as we're used to talking about it, but the concept of forgiveness as a sort of social technology, and the way that that relates to a lot of the religious traditions that have sprung up as aspects of our behavioral landscape across the millennia that humanity has been not only biologically developing, but also culturally evolving and developing. So, first, I should probably back up a little bit and talk briefly about why this was actually interesting or perhaps important to me or important in my life, why this actually mattered, why this was a curiosity, or how I came across this idea or why I developed this perspective. And basically, a lot of it boils down to the fact that growing up, I was raised Catholic. And that led to some interesting internal conflict. Not only was I Catholic, but my parents, while also being somewhat devoutly religious and taking me to church every weekend, my father was and still is a physician, and my mother's a nurse practitioner, both of whom are also pretty well educated and, generally speaking, took me to many different locations where I would also learn scientific worldviews. And I was also in public schools, so I learned science in school. We went to museums, and I was very fascinated by this scientific worldview as well. And as many of you know, and as the world continuously struggles with, there is a tension between these two worldviews, between the objective worldview of science and the modes of verification and understanding of the world and processes around us, and the narratively encoded aspects of human culture carrying certain types of wisdom and tradition with it through time that may not necessarily square up with the the scientific or more modern worldviews that we often espouse as the primary worldviews driving society today. And so in that context, as I grew up, I became far more inclined towards the scientific side of the spectrum. So much so that for quite a while in my life, you would not be far off if you classified me as an anti-theist. I probably would have classified, in fact, did classify myself for a while as an anti-theist. During that period of time, it was certainly quite common for me to uh, boil many of society's ills down to the root cause of religious perspectives and religious incongruences between that worldview or their worldviews, and simultaneously the worldviews of other religions, and largely the worldviews of the rationalist or scientific community. So all the religious communities over here, as a sort of older mode of understanding knowledge, as a way that humanity collated and perhaps aggregated some sorts of behavioral knowledge that was useful at a given time, but now we've completely moved on beyond that. It's no longer necessary. And I held that perspective for quite a while, all the way up through college and even after college. But during college, I also developed quite an interest in evolutionary game theory. I was studying that. And when I was studying that, I kind of planted certain seeds in my mind, seeds of curiosity about the way that games play out, or the way that you can look at certain evolutionary phenomena as games, as iterated gameplay, and wrote my senior thesis on the evolution of human altruism, which was a fascinating experience trying to understand all the different perspectives in terms of how something like altruism could have arisen in the evolutionary context that is usually considered such a, I guess, red in tooth and claw type of competitive environment. And where does this cooperative instinct emerge from, and how does it stabilize, and what is that meaning? What is the meaning behind those types of discoveries that we may or may not make for other parts of society? Obviously, one would pretty easily make the connection between these questions of cooperation and competition in the economic domain with respect to certain ways of interpreting the mode of capitalist economic, or the fundamental mode of capitalist economy, or principles of capitalist economy, versus perhaps other sets of principles that are slightly less oriented around pure competition. And so this all goes back to this question of forgiveness, and why are we talking about all this other stuff in something that's presumably about the idea of forgiveness? And that's because this idea of forgiveness was actually the lens into, there's one place where I saw, it was one lens through which I began seeing symmetries between what we were learning and what we are discovering in the domain of complex game theoretic systems and the evolution of these systems, and certain truths that humanity has carried with it, or certain ways of upregulating aspects of our cultural behavior that religion has carried with it through long periods of time. And the particular, or the first place where I saw that symmetry was actually in the domain of forgiveness and the concept of forgiveness. And that came along because I was looking at some of the work in iterated gameplay, iterated game theoretic gameplay, and there's something very well known called the prisoner's dilemma. And if you don't know, there are plenty of videos, I'm sure, on YouTube, so I'd recommend going to look at those. But just to give you a very basic rundown, you and a friend go rob a bank, you both get caught, a lot of the other evidence is damaged or destroyed, so it's not really relevant to the process. You guys are held in a prison separately, and you have to make a decision about whether or not you cooperate with each other and don't tell the officers or the judge anything, or whether you turn on your friend and defect. And if you defect, then basically you will get a certain reduction of your potential sentence, and your friend's sentence will be dramatically amplified. But the thing is, you're not allowed to cooperate. And if you're not allowed to cooperate, one might think, if you're kind of running through the mental model of how you would play that game, well, you have a lot to lose by being a sucker, quote unquote, and not trusting that your friend will also cooperate with you. And so therefore, both people tend to defect when they can't actually coordinate their actions or guarantee in any way that they're going to trust one another and cooperate in that situation. And that's just one situation, right? That's just one choice. But what if you were to play that choice out, hundreds or thousands of times? And what strategies might you use if you were to actually try to understand, without formally coordinating or being able to predictably coordinate, what strategy would you use to try to increase your gains over time, or in the prisoner's dilemma context, reduce your time in prison would be another way of looking at it. And this was interesting to me because I came across the work of Robert Axelrod, and he did a very famous study in, I think it was 1980 or 81. I think he did the study in 80 and published the paper in 81 on the evolution of cooperation. And one of the things he did is he created a tournament where he invited a bunch of game theorists to create computer programs to play an iterated version of this prisoner's dilemma game. And he basically he invited multiple people to come create an algorithm to play this game. There was no real limit on how complex the algorithm could be. It could be anything as simple as this particular one that we're going to talk about called Tit-for-Tat, or some of them were far more complicated, far more complex. There were, I guess one interesting way of thinking about this is that there are different strategies for playing this game. You can have cooperative type strategies of various levels of complexity. You can have certain types of sneaky strategies that try to convince others that they're going to cooperate, but then defect, trying to gain an advantage across time. But interestingly enough, of all of the different strategies, after many rounds of playing this game in a tournament style where all these different strategies played against one another, the strategy that emerged as the overall winner was a strategy called tit for tat. Very simple strategy, which is basically along the lines of, if you screw me over, I will screw you back, and if you cooperate with me, I will cooperate with you. So that quality of being able to switch between those modes of cooperation or punishment based on what the other person is doing is called, or at least in this study, they were calling it being provocable. So you could either be provoked to punishment if somebody defected against you, or you could be provoked to cooperation or forgiveness. You could return from that state of punishment to a state of forgiveness or a state of cooperation. And it was interesting to me that this act of moving from punishment to cooperation, where someone is defecting at first and then and then you move to a state in which you're both cooperating again, it's a very interesting transition psychologically. Or even if you were to consider that from a community standpoint, it's much easier to envision these scenarios where someone screws you over and you move from a place where you're happy with each other to a place where you are contentious and you're feuding, for example. It's actually a lot more difficult to imagine, and it's more difficult in your own life. I mean, just think about the scenarios in your own life when you're trying to return from a state of contentiousness or a state of broken trust to a state of cooperation, mutual cooperation. Again, it's actually not an easy task at all at any scale, whether you're talking about the individual or the family, or a relationship, or you're talking about two different communities. In fact, we have entire histories of stories about these very popular feuds. I mean, Romeo and Juliet involves a family feud, and various aspects of our cultural lineage in the Southeast is very wrapped up in the idea of feuding families, where for generations there will be a blood feud that's held onto, and they never let go. They never forgive one another. And it's interesting. It was interesting to me because it seemed as if any social technology, anything that you could add on top of the basic bare level of biological and physical reality in that system, anything that you could layer on to help a given group of people converge more closely around the type of dynamics that you would see in this tit-for-tat exchange, this capacity to forgive, this capacity to both punish and forgive. But when I was first looking at it, I was really interested in the forgiveness aspect of this. Any type of social technology that you might be able to install into a given culture that could allow a culture to more effectively return to a state of cooperation from a state of non-cooperation would play very much in the broader scale of space and time, very much like the tit-for-tat game played in the tournament that Axelrod had, which is, in effect, it won the tournament. And the interesting thing to know about the way that it won the tournament is not that it won by beating all of the other players down. In fact, it never, in any given competition with any other partner, it never actually beat those partners. It got so many points over time because it was so good at cooperating with any other strategy and defending against any strategy that tried to take advantage of it. So it was able to play this very robust strategy across space and time against a set of other strategies that were both friendly and non-friendly. And by doing so, it was able to, on the whole, come out with a much better outcome than any other strategy. And so, much the same way, anything that, and also let's secondarily apply the idea that from a psychological perspective and not just the game theoretical perspective, we all resonate and know that it's actually much harder, it feels much harder, and it is much harder to return to a place of cooperation from non-cooperation than it is to go from a place of cooperation to non-cooperation. So cooperation, you could look at cooperation as kind of a fragile state that requires work and a certain degree of interpersonal or social coherence or cohesion to be able to sustain that cooperative dynamic. And so returning to that cooperative dynamic is not easy. And if anything could move the needle in a society such that it was able to return to cooperative dynamics at every scale or at any scale more effectively, it would have, generally speaking, a competitive advantage externally facing. And it seemed to me that that was actually very much what was espoused. And I'm not familiar, and I'm somewhat familiar with many different texts of religion, but mostly I was familiar with the Bible at that point in time because I had been raised Catholic, and so that was my most salient point of familiarity. But that said, there's a deep resonance with the things that humanity, or the things that lineage of culture that eventually gave rise to this text decided to encode in that. So there's definitely an idea of provocability, both to retribution, but even more so with the addition of the New Testament, which many people ask, well, why is that there if it's so different than the Old Testament? Like, why did they get put together, and why was it decided to, how was that assembled, and why was it assembled, and why did it persist in its current form? And I think one answer to that is because of the fact that adding that New Testament aspect actually added a cultural technology that was much more in favor of the idea of forgiveness, and allowed for any culture that really took that to heart to perhaps play a more robust game theoretic game, or cooperate and compete in a more robust manner with the other societies around them, its neighbors, and by doing so, therefore, across time, generally expand. And I think that one can proffer many different reasons, and it's obviously an overdetermined question as to why this Christian religion has spread for as long as it did. And that's not necessarily something that I want to get into, and I don't think that this is exclusive only to Christianity, but what I am saying is that it was interesting to me, as someone who once held science and religion in such diametric opposition, actually going deep into human behavior through the path of science and game theory and mathematics, and then falling out in an area where there was actually a lot of symmetry with what appeared to be certain cultural maxims that were brought with us we carried with us through history as encoded by these cultural texts, these religious texts, and then embedded them in narrative so that we could, we didn't have writing. We haven't had writing for forever. So we had to, at one point, have narrative encodings of these rule sets that were robust and resilient to different modes of transmission, not just transmissible in books or online, because those were not always available or cheap. And for a very large period of human history, people were not literate either. And so, generally speaking, it's no surprise then that we find these kind of narrative encodings of game theoretic technologies like forgiveness and others, but I just wanted to talk about forgiveness today. It's no surprise that we find these packaged in these particular types of cultural or religious packaging and carried with us across time. And seeing religion in that light has allowed me to, I don't consider myself necessarily religious to this day, but I've had the capacity, or now I have the capacity, to be much more open-minded, much more open-hearted, and have much more constructive and productive conversations with those who deeply nest their lives and behaviors within that religious frame, because I can actually understand how these systems operate as behavioral attractors, and also understand how, from the scientific perspective, especially from the scientific perspective of analyzing any one single behavior or any very short-term pattern of behaviors that are encouraged by a deep religious tradition, it might be very easy to label those things as irrational or generally counter to our values. But it's not so obvious to me anymore that these systems, these encodings of our collective ethics that we call religion, are as fragile or are as disposable as the scientific worldview might otherwise think, or those who in modern times promote the idea that we are capable and we sufficiently understand the dynamics of ourselves, but also of our collectives, that we are in sufficient control of that to dispose of these very deeply ingrained cultural technologies that we've also just begun to really understand in terms of their role in shaping our collective and game theoretic behavior. So I think I'll stop there, and let me know what you think. Obviously, this is a contentious and controversial topic, but yeah, forgiveness as a technology, generally speaking, has this technology has been adopted and encoded in religious frameworks, and we are just now beginning to understand through the scientific lens that there's actually quite a bit more utility there than we may have initially thought. So I'll leave you with that, and have a good